I am pleased that the United States and North Korea yesterday reached agreement on the text of a framework document on North Korea's nuclear program.
The revelation that North Korea is constructing a suspicious underground site have raised questions about the North Korean compliance with the agreed framework we negotiated in 1994.
There's a question here about whether the North Koreans can actually accomplish this.
There was swift international condemnation soon after North Korea's official state media confirmed the country had successfully conducted an underground nuclear test.
Now, on North Korea specifically, since President Obama's taken office, we've made clear that we are prepared to talk directly with the North Koreans, and we are open to an agreement that would also provide security for North Korea.
North Korea's economy has collapsed. It is isolated. It is under heavy international sanctions. However, we have failed to stop North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons.
If you're North Korea and you think that the Americans and the ROC are coming, your smartest move is to go early and go massively because you don't know what's going to survive.
I don't think there is a possibility of getting North Korea under any circumstances within the next, say, 10 to 20 years to actually give up nuclear weapons.
And at the heart of the mounting anxiety and sense of insecurity lies the persistent doubt about whether nuclear-armed North Korea can be effectively deterred, even with extended U.S. nuclear deterrence.
If you've got deterrence and assurance, let's say you've got sanctions, you've got encouraging societal change in North Korea, you've got diplomacy. Pursuing any one of those significantly further results potentially now in trade-offs across other policy lines.
Will we get that deal? We don't know, but we should be supporting the diplomacy, supporting our South Korean allies in the process, and making constructive criticisms.
Hi, thank you for being with us today. We have Steve Biegun, who was appointed in August 2018 to be the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea. He's the tip of the spear of the Trump administration's diplomatic initiative in North Korea, and I'm very happy. I'm Helene Cooper, Pentagon correspondent with the New York Times. I'm very happy to be here, and we're really excited to have Steve. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much.
So you've now been on the job for 6 months. How is it going?
It feels like a lot more than 6 months.
Really?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying the obvious, that diplomacy is still very much alive. And while we haven't made as much progress in the 6 months as I would have hoped coming in on the first day, we stay closely engaged with our counterparts in North Korea. We just came off of a summit meeting in Hanoi where President Trump and Chairman Kim Jongun spent 2 days together discussing some very weighty issues. And the president said in his press conference, and it's true, that we remain engaged, the door is open, and we will continue to work with the North Koreans to try to achieve our shared goal of the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, our goal, final, fully verified denuclearization. But let me frame it a little bit more broadly, Helene, so you have a sense of what we've been up to for the last 6 months as well. So the president held his summit with Chairman Kim on June 12th of 2018, so about 8 months ago. And out of that summit meeting, the two leaders agreed to a joint statement that laid out 4 areas that we would work together in order to try to advance a better outcome for the Korean Peninsula. The first was to transform relations between the U.S. and the DPRK. The second was to work towards a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. The third was the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And the fourth was to recover the remains of those who fell in the Korean War, and that remains a very important priority. Since June of 2018, we've had steady engagement with the North Koreans. Secretary Pompeo made his first trip after the summit to Pyongyang in July of 2018. He spent an entire day with his counterpart, Kim Jong-chol, a senior North Korean official who Chairman Kim has appointed as his primary, Secretary Pompeo's primary counterpart. Those meetings were tough. They were the first time where we started to try to put detail into the agreements, particularly around denuclearization. And while those meetings didn't produce a certain outcome, they set the stage for many of the future discussions that have taken place after that. In August is when I started with the State Department, August 23rd. And I started, 2 days after I started, the Secretary and I were scheduled to visit North Korea for the Secretary's next visit. The President, in reviewing the circumstances around that trip, made a determination that North Korea probably wasn't yet ready to make some of the commitments we were looking for, and he asked the Secretary of State to postpone that trip, and the Secretary did. In February, the Secretary traveled to the UN General Assembly in New York, and he and I had a very good meeting with the Foreign Minister of North Korea, Ri Yong-ho, where we covered a number of issues, although Foreign Minister Ri was quite clear that the denuclearization issues were not going to be in his portfolio at present, that they were assigned to Kim Jong-chol from the United Front Department of the Korean Workers' Party. In October, Secretary Pompeo was invited to Pyongyang a second time. He and I went to Pyongyang on 5th of October, spent an entire day with Chairman Kim Jongun, with his sister Kim Yo-jong. Some of the day was spent with Kim Jong-chol. And again, we had a chance to surface a lot of the very important issues around all four commitments that the two leaders made in the Singapore joint statement. Going into November, it was our expectation that we would have a final framing meeting and really the kickoff of working level talks. And that was scheduled for the first part of November. And a few days before that meeting, we received a word from North Korea that there were scheduling issues, that they had other issues that were complicating their participation, and they asked for a postponement of that meeting. We don't know the full circumstances around that, and like so much else about North Korea, even with the incredible resources we have available to us, we had to engage in some speculation as what was happening. At the same time, North Korea was disengaging also from China, from Russia, from South Korea, and we're not quite sure what happened and what transpired inside North Korea during the months of November and December. But whatever it was, it's like a switch came back on in late December, partially driven, in fact, really driven by an exchange of letters between President Trump and Chairman Kim. We began to see tightened up engagement between us and the North Koreans that flowed into Chairman Kim's New Year's address. In his New Year's address, which is their equivalent of the State of the Union address, Chairman Kim reaffirmed his commitment both to denuclearization as well as to transferring the resources in his economy to developing, in his country to develop the domestic economy. Those messages were reassuring, and they set in motion a series of visits that have had us engaged with North Koreans almost nonstop since the new year. Kim Jong-chol, the Secretary's counterpart, came here in mid-January, spent a full day with the Secretary. He also had an extended visit with President Trump in the Oval Office that covered a lot of topics. At that same visit in mid-January, I was introduced to my new counterpart, recently appointed, the Special Representative for the United States, so a direct mirror of my portfolio here in the U.S., and his name was Kim Hyuk-chol. And during that visit in mid-January, we had our first working level negotiations. 6 months after the Singapore summit, but we were finally engaged by mid-January in rather intense discussions with the North Koreans, framing out an agenda for discussions and a schedule for discussions. And also during the course of that meeting in mid-January, the decision was made to proceed with a second summit meeting at the end of February in Vietnam. So working toward that, I took a team of experts and scientists, international law experts, negotiators to Pyongyang in early February. We spent several days in Pyongyang engaged with our North Korean counterparts, again further framing out a set of issues that both sides would like to advance in the framework of the joint statement that came out of the Singapore summit. We broke briefly and then returned to meet again in Hanoi, where we met for several days in the run-up to the summit, and then participated in the summit meeting between the two leaders. The point I want to make with that framing is that we have been closely engaged with the North Koreans, especially over the last couple of months, and it's certainly our expectation we'll be able to continue that close engagement in order to advance the shared goals of the two leaders as expressed in the Singapore summit.
Okay, well, thanks for the framing, and I'm glad that you bring up the sort of the relaunch of talks in January, because the January timeframe is sort of what I wanted to start speaking with you about. In your Stanford speech back in January, you seemed to suggest that the United States was totally open to confidence-building steps. And there's certainly one of the things, as soon as I've been getting a lot of tweets from people and questions from people wanting to direct to you, the whole idea of whether or not the American stance is hardening. Because in your Stanford speech, you said, quote, "From our side, we are prepared to discuss many actions that could help build trust between our two countries and advance further progress in parallel on the Singapore summit objectives of transforming relations, establishing a permanent peace regime on the peninsula, and complete denuclearization." You said that, and that sounds totally, that sounds like an opening for negotiations. But last week, a senior administration official said this at the State Department: "Nobody in the administration advocates a step-by-step approach. In all cases, expectations is complete denuclearization of North Korea as a condition for all other steps. That's a position supported by the entire interagency," end quote. Mm-hmm. Which is it?
The semantic differences, I have to say, escape me. All four of these priorities are linked. The United States is interested in transforming relations with the DPRK. The United States is interested in advancing a permanent peace regime with North Korea. The United States is absolutely interested in pursuing denuclearization with North Korea. And the fourth pillar, as I mentioned, the return of remains, very much remains a high priority for us as well. They're all linked. They're all proceeding in parallel. The United States has discussed many initiatives in each of these areas with the North Koreans, but as is so often the case, that nothing can be agreed until everything's agreed. That's a clear principle that has permeated our negotiations on both sides with the North Koreans. That's not to say that we can't take steps to build confidence between the two countries, but the foundation of this policy is denuclearization, and until we can get to some point where we have the same traction on that issue that we have on the other issues, it makes it very difficult for us to move forward. You've heard the President himself talk about many of the issues that would build confidence, and most recently at the summit, he had an exchange in front of the press on this very point. These are issues that we have explored in detail with our North Koreans, in parallel with denuclearization. But we're just not there on denuclearization, and that was the issue at the summit that really challenged us to move forward with a more complete agreement. We've closed some gaps. As the President and the Secretary said, we had a very constructive discussion, but we're not there yet. And that's the place where we really need to exert the most effort to see if we can advance an agenda that achieves all of these issues in parallel, not just in isolation.
But I think that's where there's some confusion. Are you saying then that the United States is open to do this incrementally? And if you don't do this incrementally, how can you get it all done? Why should North Korea believe that at the end of this rainbow we'll get a pot of gold?
Yeah, we are not going to do denuclearization incrementally. The President has been clear on that, and that is a position around which the U.S. government has complete unity. Our goal, our objective is the final fully verified denuclearization of North Korea. One of the reasons we were unable to reach a final agreement in Hanoi was, as the President laid out, the North Koreans had offered a portion of their nuclear program in exchange for lifting basically all of the sanctions against North Korea. In effect, that would have put us in a position where we, and presumably the international community, because these are United Nations Security Council sanctions, not United Nations sanctions, we would be in a position where we would be lifting all of the economic pressure that's been imposed upon North Korea for the totality of its weapons of mass destruction programs. We'd lift that pressure, but in exchange for only a portion of those weapons of mass destruction programs. That would have put us in a position, a very difficult position, of essentially subsidizing what would potentially be ongoing development of weapons of mass destruction in North Korea. We need a total solution. This is why the president, this is what the president brought to the table, and this is what the president sincerely conveyed to Chairman Kim Jongun. The United States is ready to go down this road with North Korea, to transform relations, to create a permanent peace regime, to denuclearize, and also to close some of the humanitarian issues like the return of remains. But North Korea has to be committed. And what the president, as the president said at his press conference, he challenged Chairman Kim to go big, to buy into the vision, to do this together with us. I know the North Koreans found that difficult to accept. Obviously, we didn't get to a point at the summit in Hanoi where we could reach an agreement on that broad framework. But we're prepared to continue trying. The door is open to diplomacy. We want a very different future for the United States and North Korea on the Korean Peninsula, and the President is 100% supportive of us remaining engaged diplomatically to try to achieve that goal. The gap is still just a little bit too large for us to get there today.
I'm going to try this a slightly different way, because you are certainly aware that there is a narrative that is out there right now that National Security Advisor John Bolton has now got a hold of the process, and that the United States position has hardened considerably. Are you saying that the Trump administration position has not hardened?
No. The Trump administration position is not hardened. From the very beginning, the U.S. view has been to achieve the final fully verified denuclearization of North Korea. The president on down have said that the lifting of sanctions will come with attaining that goal. That's not to say that we can't continue to talk with the North Koreans and that there aren't other areas we can explore outside of the lifting of sanctions that can potentially advance all the Singapore commitments that the two leaders made. But there's absolutely been no difference in or distinction in the U.S. policy on denuclearization. I will say that I am acutely aware that I inherited a portfolio that for 25 years has been mired in political disagreements, in policy differences, and also has a fairly miserable record of achievement. We started this diplomacy with North Korea with the agreed framework in the early 1990s, and one can debate why each subsequent initiative failed and who was at fault, but you can't deny the outcome. Starting in 1994, really starting in 1992, when the North and the South agreed to not pursue nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, racing forward 27 years to today, we have a nuclear weapons state on the Korean Peninsula. So the policies have been a failure. The Trump administration's policy is to push very hard across all fronts. We want to build confidence. We want to build trust. We want to end the war, which is currently in abeyance with the 1953 armistice. We want to heal the wounds of war. We want to recover the remains of the soldiers, very much for the same reasons that helped us normalize relations in other places like Vietnam at the end of the conflict. It's all part of a total strategy, but it does require North Korea to be fully committed to the elimination of its weapons of mass destruction, and that's what the president was challenging Kim Jongun to buy into that vision completely. And if they do, as the president has said, we will exceed their expectations and what we can achieve together on the Korean Peninsula.
You guys all know that we're going to be taking questions in a very complicated iPad-related manner in a few minutes. My former colleague, Michael Gordon, didn't trust this, so he emailed me a question he wanted me to get in. And I want to read this email from Gordon because it gets to the point that you're talking about, and it gets again to the are we moving the goalpost issue. President Trump has repeatedly stated publicly that he has no fixed timeline for completing the negotiations with North Korea and is not in a rush to denuclearize North Korea as long as Pyongyang does not conduct nuclear missile tests At UNGA in September, Mr. Trump said, quote, "I don't want to get into the time game. If it takes 2 years, 3 years, or 5 months, it doesn't matter. There's no nuclear testing and there's no testing of rockets." But last Thursday, the senior State Department official said that the goal was to denuclearize North Korea and eliminate the North's ICBMs during Mr. Trump's current term in office. Who is right, President Trump or the senior State Department official?
Yeah. So the president has not set an artificial time limit on this process. That's absolutely right. In question to how long would it take us, we stand by the expectation that if we fully mobilized our resources and if we worked with the North Koreans and not had to do this over their objection, that we could align ourselves in a manner sufficient to achieve this in something approaching a year. We continue to push for this process to begin, and it has been said many times that this will be something that we would like to get done in the president's first term. But ultimately, it requires the North Koreans to start, Helene, and that's the missing variable right now, is that the North Koreans have to be similarly bought into that objective. And so the pressure is not on us, and I think that's implicit in what the president is saying. The United States has preserved all of the pressure of its international sanctions coming out of the Hanoi summit. And the international sanctions are actually quite tough and continue to put significant hardship on the Korean economy. At a minimum, this limits the resources that could be available to divert the weapons of mass destruction programs. But in the best case also, it creates the right combination of incentives for North Korea to choose this path. The president has been also very clear about sanctions. He doesn't desire to impose or sustain sanctions against North Korea. He'd like to have us in a position where we can lift them, but we have to get the North Koreans to begin that process of denuclearization. There is no artificial timetable on this. It doesn't have to be done by X date, and we won't be driven by an artificial timetable. Key here, again, the missing variable is North Korea has to be fully invested in the final fully verified denuclearization. We've discussed that with them. We've discussed what that means with the North Koreans. They understand our point of view, and we're going to continue to work to see if we can close the gaps and reach a common approach on that. We weren't able to do that at the summit in Hanoi, and so we'll continue to work at it and see if we can't get there as soon as possible.
Okay. What do the North Koreans mean when they say close Yongbyon? There's some confusion about what exactly that might mean. I mean, you had working level talks in Hanoi before Trump arrived. How do you think that, do both sides agree on what exactly, do both sides have a clear understanding of what exactly that means?
So we have no agreement to close Yongbyon. Let me just state that up front. So there's no agreed approach to anything related to Yongbyon at present. But that's a good question, and it's the right question to ask, because Yongbyon can be many different things. Yongbyon in the 2008 declaration as part of the six-party talks was a plutonium reactor and a plutonium reprocessing facility. We also know that over the course of that decade that the North Koreans had developed a undeclared highly enriched uranium capability at Yongbyon. And so obviously the production of fissile material at Yongbyon comes from both a uranium facility as well as a plutonium facility, both of which are usable in the development of nuclear weapons. But Yongbyon is much more than that too. Yongbyon is a whole industrial complex involved in the nuclear fuel cycle and nuclear weapons development in North Korea. It consists of dozens, if not hundreds, of facilities spread across a large area that is generically referred to as Yongbyon. What we're asking the North Koreans to do in the process of denuclearization is to eliminate all dimensions of the nuclear fuel cycle and the nuclear weapons program. And so our definition of Yongbyon would be quite expansive. In our discussions with the North Koreans, I won't go into every detail of how they have chosen to describe Yongbyon, but let me just say, in general, it's been shifting. Things like this are why it is so important that in a denuclearization process, you also have an accompanying declaration. We need to agree on the definition of the North Korean weapons programs. We can begin some elements of the denuclearization before that declaration is complete. And in the case of the 2008 declaration, it took approximately 9 months to generate it. And if the North Koreans are willing to proceed immediately with steps to begin addressing elements of their weapons of mass destruction program, we won't hold up for that. But we do have to have a complete declaration. An industrial site like Yongbyon illustrates exactly why it's so important that we agree on the full set of capabilities and also what they hold as a consequence of their complex of weapons of mass destruction.
I'm going to try to resist asking you to channel the mind of Kim Jongun, but it's a little difficult, and I've been trying to restrain myself. There have been some missile launch site activity recently, which U.S. satellites has picked up. What do you think Kim is trying to signal with this?
So I think you're referring to some of the open source reporting that doesn't show a missile launch. It shows activities at some of the sites that have traditionally been involved with their rocket and/or missile programs. And so, I think you and I would agree, Helene. It's very important that we be precise when we talk about things. North Korea has not launched a missile.
But it's activity.
There's activity, right? So the short answer is. We don't know. What Kim Jongun will decide to do, may very much be his decision and his decision alone. We have, I think the president has made abundantly clear what our point of view is on that. The president's statements last week that he would be disappointed, very disappointed, if in fact this happened, and we don't know that it's intended to send any particular statement to us. One of the things I mentioned that I'm acutely aware that I've inherited a portfolio of issues that is steeped in 25 years of difficult policy battles and politics. But also there's a phenomena that I would observe around the North Korean issues, and that's of the snap judgment of so many experts to drive to an immediate conclusion about anything that's happening in North Korea. So 2 instances I would cite that aren't entirely dissimilar from this, where we also don't know. So sometime during the fall last year, the North Koreans surprised the world with a press report that they had just completed the successful test of an advanced tactical weapon. So tactical. So they were signaling in their own wording that that was not a strategic weapon, which would imply weapons of mass destruction. And I was astounded by the immediate analysis that this was a message to the United States, that this was the end of diplomacy, that this was a provocation directed at us. And here we are, probably 4 or 5 months later. I don't think there's an expert alive who can even tell me what they tested or if they tested anything. All they released was a picture of Chairman Kim Jongun standing on a beach in a coastal area, surrounded by men in uniform, holding notepads, writing notes. And in a large part of the analysts in the commentariat were immediately interpreting this as a message directly at the president, directly at the United States. To this day, we don't know what that entailed. The more recent example is last week, while speculation was building about what's happening around Sohae and some of the other sites traditionally associated with North Korean missile and rocket tests. There was a seismic event that the press reported was measured somewhere north of the DMZ at some level on the Richter scale of approximately 2.0. And immediately I saw headlines and analysis that this was a statement coming out of the Hanoi summit. There was even some implication against defiance of all analytical evidence that this could have been a nuclear test. And it continues to boggle my mind at how quickly so many are pressing to reach conclusions about all this.
You think the press is beating the war drumbeat?
It's a competition in the 24-hour news cycle, but it's not just the press, it's the think tank and the analytical community as well. If you read the analysis in the run-up to the Hanoi summit, and you were sitting where I was sitting, you would think a lot of it was completely detached from reality. on what was being speculated and provided as fact. Now, that's an operational challenge that is going to exist in any important international diplomatic endeavor like this. Added to it is the fact that there's multiple national interests and at play here. So I wouldn't lay any blame, and I wouldn't say anybody is pressuring us. I just say that the tendency to reach these snap conclusions is in my view a little bit hasty. And I will say that we take very seriously what the reports that we've seen about what's happening at Sohae, and we're watching it. As some of my colleagues in the administration have said, we have the resources to do that, and that we don't need to depend upon commercial satellite photography. But I will say that let's see how it plays out. Right now, I don't know what message they are trying to send. We certainly have sent our message loudly and clearly from the President of the United States that we would not think that would be a productive step for them to test a rocket or a missile.
Okay. Some of the reporting that came out of Hanoi suggested that we've now added chemical and biological weapons development to the table in the negotiations. Have we? And again, this gets back to the whole moving the goalpost thing that I keep harping on.
Yeah. So since the day I arrived and adopted this portfolio, the effort to bring a more permanent peace to the Korean Peninsula has involved the elimination of all weapons of mass destruction. It would hardly make sense to remove the threat of nuclear weapons from North Korea and endorse the continued presence of chemical and biological weapons. It would be unacceptable to us. It would be unacceptable to North Korea's neighbors, including Russia, China, Japan, and South Korea. But also, to suggest it's moving the goalpost is in defiance of the factual history of the issue of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction programs. If you read the UN Security Council resolutions, they are as pointed on the issues of chemical and biological weapons as they are on nuclear weapons. And ultimately, the process of final fully verified denuclearization is to set the antecedent for the lifting of those sanctions. Those sanctions, which are international sanctions imposed unanimously by the UN Security Council, would also look to the elimination of biological and chemical weapons programs as part of the complete process that we're undertaking. So this issue is one that we've discussed with the North Koreans. It is not new, and it would be a very serious oversight on our part to leave any weapons of mass destruction out of the equation if we truly are going to be successful in transforming the Korean Peninsula in order to have a much more peaceful and engaged relationship, not only between the United States and North Korea, but between North Korea and all of its neighbors. You know, Helene, we talk a lot about the challenges of the diplomacy, about the need to decipher opaque messages that are sent to us, and also about the complexities that are involved in this process, which generically is called denuclearization, but really is the elimination of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. But I also think we need to focus just as much on the positive possibilities too. The diplomatic engagement between the United States and North Korea since June of last year has not been without its results. Yes, the president has frequently cited the moratorium the North Koreans have on nuclear and missile tests, as well as the partial dismantlement of Sohae and Tongchang-ri as it's called, and also Punggye-ri. And while these steps aren't permanent and irreversible, as the news accounts of the last few days have sent us, they also are not inconsequential entirely. They offer some insight into the direction that we believe North Korea is willing to take, and what we need to see them do is go farther down the road. But outside that, there's been much else as well. The United States is more engaged with North Korea diplomatically right now than we have been in the past decade. We are deeply engaged in a regularized contact that I laid out a little bit in my framing remarks up front. And the North Koreans are also involved in outreach with their neighbors, with China, with a halting discussion with Japan and with South Korea. And the South Koreans and the North Koreans are working very closely also to try to lower hostilities on the Korean Peninsula and create an opening for the full vision that President Trump laid out at Singapore to come to fruition. I have traveled recently to the demilitarized zone in North Korea. The demilitarized zone was affected by a number of confidence-building measures that were negotiated between Chairman Kim and President Moon Jae-in of South Korea late last year in consultation with the United Nations Command and the U.S. Forces Korea. They've taken a number of steps around the demilitarized zone in order to lower tensions. The elimination of all weapons has been implemented in the joint security area around Panmunjom Village. It's a remarkable thing, and for those of you who are in Korea or have the opportunity to visit the DMZ, I would strongly commend it. I think some of the details are still being worked out in the final arrangements in the DMZ. I'd heard from someone recently that it's not so easy to travel there until all the remaining issues are implemented around this set of agreements. But I was able to visit, and I'll tell you, it's just a palpable difference from anything I've seen since I first visited the DMZ in 1988. Over those 31 years, we have gone from a feeling of two armies bristling with weapons, poised on a very narrow buffer on the Korean Peninsula, to a more calm and orderly and engagement. There's regular communications between the North, South, and with the UN Command in the DMZ. These are not inconsequential changes that have taken place on the Korean Peninsula. So as we focus on the urgency of this particular issue or that, or the crisis or potential crisis du jour, I think we also need to step back and realize that over the past 8 months, President Trump's diplomacy with North Korea and South Korea's diplomacy with North Korea have created space for many constructive things to happen. And while we're a long way away from where we need to be, and as I said at the beginning of my remarks, we're not nearly as far along on denuclearization as I would have hoped we are. We're making progress. We're still engaged diplomatically. The door remains open. The president was emphatic on this point coming out of the Hanoi summit. The conversations were constructive. They ended without an agreement, but they didn't end badly. And so I don't want to lose sight of the positives in this environment as we focus on the particular issues or controversies or semantics of the moment.
That's a lovely wrap up, and it's like, if I was a nicer person, I would now open it up to questions, but I have a couple more of my own that I want to squeeze in there. I think at this point, I'm supposed to tell you guys that the app, whatever we're doing here, is open, and you can send in your stuff. It says incorrect password, so I don't even know if this is going to work. This isn't working. But in the meantime, you brought up steps that we've taken. One of them, I couldn't sit here as a Pentagon reporter and not ask you about the continued suspension of military exercises between the United States and South Korea in the peninsula. President Trump himself has called them expensive and provocative. How do you see this continued suspension playing, or what kind of role do you think that this continues to play in your negotiations? Mm-hmm. You know that people at the Pentagon don't like this.
Yeah. So what the president said is, and this is a unilateral policy, but the president is committed to it, is that he's suspended major joint military exercises between the United States and South Korea. Or as he referred to them as war games. And that remains the policy. The president reaffirmed it from the podium.
The war games thing really got them at the Pentagon because they really don't like that.
The president reaffirmed that point from the podium in Hanoi when he did his press conference. But I will also say that I think the Pentagon has done a fantastic job of working within the parameters of that policy.
Because we've continued to do the military exercises, we just don't call them that.
To make sure we do the necessary military training that any responsible decision maker at the Pentagon would want to undertake. We do. Militaries have to train. We have 28,500 U.S. soldiers on the Korean Peninsula, and they need to be prepared always to defend the mission that's been assigned to them. My job from the Department of State is to give them the diplomacy they deserve. General Robert Abrams, our commander of U.S. Forces Korea and the head of United Nations Command, his job is to make sure they're ready. The President's job is to set the policy for the United States of America. And the President has done that clearly, unambiguously, and notwithstanding what you're hearing, my view is that he's fully supported by his advisors, and that they have, within the parameters of that, developed an approach to training our forces that is acceptable. So, I think we're in a good place.
I'm going to be going to questions shortly, but just one, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you why, in light of the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, why would the North, this goes back to the issue of trust, why would North Korea feel comfortable at all in striking an agreement with the United States?
So I'm not expert on the JCPOA, although, much of that all of that was negotiated during a period in which I wasn't serving in government. But I would make an observation as a layman, which is probably somewhat dangerous, since I'm no longer a layman, and that is that my sense is the JCPOA failed for a number of reasons, including the fact that once it was put in place, it appeared, at least to me from the outside, that Iran doubled down on its aggressive behavior in the region.
But this was an Iran nuclear deal. It wasn't a deal about Iran and funding Hezbollah and anything like that. This was a nuclear deal. Okay. It did not renege on the nuclear obligations.
I didn't say they reneged on it. You're asking me how the North Koreans would see that differently. Let me tell you how they would see it differently, Helene. What we're engaged with the North Koreans is much bigger than denuclearization. Although the denuclearization is the foundation for the policies, and it's ultimately the test of whether or not we're going to be successful, the President is also committed to transforming relations, to creating a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, and also an agenda to close and heal the wounds of a war that happened almost 70 years ago. President Trump's vision is much bigger than the very narrow vision in the agreed framework. And it seems to me it's not a flaw of the agreed framework, it's a flaw of the diplomacy with Iran. The presumption that we could reach a narrowly focused denuclearization agreement, regardless of what you think about the merits of it. And at the same time, the relationship would develop in a manner that was successful, while Iran was doubling down on aggressive behavior around the region and around the world. And so what's different is that this is a much larger vision than what was encompassed in the JCPOA. That doesn't mean it's going to be easier, and ultimately, whatever we do in this diplomacy will have to pass the test of public opinion, and ultimately will have to pass the test of support in the United States Congress. That's another flaw of the JCPOA agreement, is it's a shortcut to bypass the Congress. And the JCPOA did it, and the agreed framework did it too, for that matter, and it makes them much less durable. So if I were coaching the North Koreans, I would say, do the right thing, denuclearize, engage in this full agenda, shift the momentum of the entire 70-year history of war and hostility on the Korean Peninsula to one in which the United States and North Korea are engaged toward a much brighter future. That's what we're working on. That's what we're doing in parallel. That's all the things we're doing. It's not at the expense of denuclearization. That is the foundation for our policy, and that will ultimately be the test of success. But our vision is bigger than that, too.
Okay. I'm ready to ask your questions. Jeff Brumfield.
You sound skeptical.
That. Huh? I'm not skeptical at all. From Jeff Brumfield, can you tell us your understanding of what the North Koreans offered in Hanoi? And if the North agreed to more limited sanctions relief in exchange for Yongbyon, would you be receptive?
So ultimately, it was the president's decision in Hanoi, and I think, like virtually all of his advisors, I think we had a pretty good understanding of what the North Koreans were proposing. What the North Koreans were proposing is to eliminate some portion of their nuclear weapons program in exchange for the lifting of basically all sanctions. Now, whether that portion that really doesn't rest upon the definition of Yongbyon. Although, as I said earlier, even over the course of the last few weeks and months, North Korea has had a shifting definition of what Yongbyon is. But really the question is, would the United States lift the sanctions against North Korea in exchange for closing down part of its nuclear fuel cycle, part of its weapons of mass destruction programs, and allow the attendant benefits to flow in a manner that in some cases might directly subsidize the ongoing development of weapons of mass destruction in non-disclosed or non-committed parts of the weapons program. And the administration has been clear from the president on down that we will not lift these sanctions until North Korea completes the process of denuclearization. That's been the president's policy for a very long time. That didn't change at Yongbyon, and didn't change at Hanoi, and it hasn't changed now.
Can I ask you briefly, and this is a little bit off the topic, but can I ask you about Otto Warmbier?
Mm-hmm.
This gets back to the whole issue of trust again. How do you as a negotiator deal with a leader who apparently said to our president that he knew nothing about the torture and what happened to Otto Warmbier? And how does that affect your ability to trust what comes out of KJU going forward?
Yeah, so the real question underneath that, Helene, is bigger, which is how do you negotiate with the leader of a system like North Korea? Because that's a bigger question, but it's all subsumed in that same. And the answer is, you do it carefully. You look for you look for sufficient verification and monitoring to ensure the outcome of the agreement, and you make sure it's done right. It's no different, I suppose, than any other negotiation, even with a benign power. The United States has to have. It's going to have to be a thorough agreement. It's going to have verification. It's going to have to have monitoring. These are all the components of a final, fully verified denuclearization, and it will be hard to get because it also is intrusive, and it's and in our intention, it has to be irreversible. Now, part of the approach that we're also undertaking is to try to change the tenor. And so we are engaging with the North Koreans directly through diplomacy. The president has, in Singapore, committed to transforming relations, to establishing permanent peace, and the other steps that I've mentioned multiple times today. It's not going to be done in isolation. But we're negotiating with a country that poses a very credible threat to its neighbors, to the region, and to the world. And we don't get to pick other countries' leaders. Chairman Kim is the leader of North Korea. We will engage with him and his representatives to see if we can address this threat.
Kate Hewitt, you mentioned that the U.S., despite not being open to incremental denuclearization, is open to pursuing confidence-building measures. Could you give a few examples of these confidence-building measures?
Mm-hmm. Certainly we're very interested in getting inspectors into North Korea, and as part of that, we're going to need some sort of permanent liaison with the North Koreans in order to be able to look out for the welfare and the rights of our people who are there. You've heard the president, in fact, at the summit in Hanoi, there was an exchange in front of the cameras between President Trump and Chairman Kim on this very issue. We're not there yet. We're not able to establish a liaison office, but this is just one that's been mentioned in public. There are a lot of other initiatives that we have discussed in private with the North Koreans that I would be loath to lay out in public because they're the subject of private discussions and negotiations between us. But we've discussed a lot of ideas, and we will continue to engage with them diplomatically to see if there's an opportunity to engage and reach agreement on some of these. But the confidence building is important here. We should never lose sight of the fact that we are fighting against a tide of 70 years of war and hostility on the Korean Peninsula. Yes, there are dramatic systemic differences between us and the North Koreans that make that additionally difficult. But this is the longest open war that the United States has anywhere in the world. The The fighting ended in 1953, and the president has been quite clear that he is prepared to change the trajectory on the Korean Peninsula for the better.
You guys know this is the International Month of Women, so I'm only going to read questions from women. Ms. Corey Hinderstein has what I think is a really good one. For the working discussions in the lead up to the Hanoi summit, the United States brought a robust delegation of nuclear sanctions, legal, and military experts, but I've not heard whether the DPRK brought an equally equivalent expert technical delegation. Were the North Koreans prepared for negotiations with an appropriately technical team across the table, or were they only interested in an exchange of views? Was this a case of you guys just sitting there and reading talking points to each other, particularly from the North Korea point of view?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into detail about what happens behind closed doors between us and the North Koreans. I think both sides owe each other a certain amount of sensitivity and respect in that regard. I will say that the North Korean delegation that has sat across from the table was highly qualified, and we presume speaks with the authority of the government of North Korea. We don't get to pick who we negotiate with. The North Koreans get to pick who they put across the table from us. But we had very good discussions. We would not have gone on for practically 2 full weeks with a gap in between if both sides weren't adequately represented. However, for sure, as we move forward in this, if we begin to get traction, both sides are going to need to increasingly draw upon technical experts. The issues at work here are highly complicated. The issues of the nuclear fuel cycle will require some of the most talented and experienced individuals in the United States government to be participants in this, and likewise the same for the North Koreans.
From Ms. Shi Gao, could we expect a third summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim shortly?
Between?
Trump and Kim Jongun?
I'm sorry,
a third summit.
A third summit. So I know the President has spoken about his willingness to continue to meet with Chairman Kim, possibly in a third summit. We don't have anything to announce today, Helene, but in our view, in the President's view, this top-level engagement does help create the space. And from my point of view as a negotiator, that kind of engagement does create space for us at the working level to test out ideas and see if we can close the gaps. So that'll ultimately be up to the President. It'll be driven by the course of events, but the President hasn't ruled that out.
Ms. Laura Rockwood, is the U.S. pressing North Korea to accept IAEA inspectors?
We would very much see part of the complete process of denuclearization in North Korea to include North Korea's return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the additional protocols. And towards that end, IAEA has a very important monitoring role in order to ensure that certain practices continue to be observed to international standards. We are not at the point where, with the North Koreans, where we're negotiating the specific composition of inspectors for some of these issues. And it's also, there's an additional level of complication that comes from the fact that, as is well known, North Korea now has acquired, has mastered the technology necessary to produce a nuclear weapon. IAEA inspectors are generally precluded from engaging in nuclear weapons programs under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it's a complicated issue, but ultimately we would be reassured very much by the involvement of the IAEA in this process as they bring tremendous expertise to bear on these kind of nuclear issues around the world.
Ms. Kaylee Thomas has, I know I'm mispronouncing that name and I apologize, but she's getting again to this whole idea of step by step. If lifting sanctions is untenable until full denuclearization is achieved, what incentives is the U.S. willing to offer the DPRK in order to achieve any progress moving toward that goal and the full vision of a U.S. DPRK relations that you described?
So again, I wasn't in government in June of last year when the Singapore summit occurred, But I remember hearing much reporting, and I think it was some official statements that suggested that the United States was prepared to move very quickly and within a year complete the process of denuclearization. As I look back on that, I think about how had this process really begun in earnest in July of last year, we would potentially be 3 or 4 months away from the moment at which we might be able, under whatever analysis was brought to bear at that point, we might be in a position to actually lift sanctions. It's occurred to me many times, because the lifting of sanctions, of course, is an issue that comes up in our discussions with the North Koreans, and with good reason. We think the sanctions are having a huge impact on the North Korean economy. The president bypassed this process question at the Hanoi summit, and he did it very convincingly by challenging Chairman Kim to go big, to move fast. Let's go for a big proposal here to eliminate these weapons of mass destruction programs. The United States is prepared to act on all of the commitments in the Singapore joint statement, which truly would transform events on the Korean Peninsula. The president has gone even further to begin laying out a vision for what he believes is a very bright economic future for North Korea as well, with its rich natural resources, its relatively undeveloped economy, and its critical location at a crossroads of China, Russia, and South Korea. The economic potential the president describes is enormous. And this is the vision that we're trying to inculcate our North Korean counterparts with, that the faster they move, the faster we get to this brighter future. The United States, I cannot be more emphatic, the United States has chosen to take this course. The president has created the space and the momentum for diplomacy. The missing variable is North Korea itself has to also fully commit to the elimination of its weapons of mass destruction and affiliated programs. And if they do that, we will get to this end point quickly.
I spent a lot of time at the Pentagon trying to get them to not talk in acronyms. Miss Alexandra Bell sounds like she belongs in that building. Listen to this. Are we demanding that DPRK sign and ratify the BWC, CWC, and CTBT? I assume we're talking about the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention. I never could figure out CTBT. That's
Comprehensive Test.
Thank you. Further, given that the BWC lacks a verification program, what tools and techniques are we planning to use to ensure their biological weapons program is eliminated?
Yeah, great question. Acronyms and all. All three of these are part of the UN Security Council resolutions. So it's not the United States that would be asking. This is actually the unanimous vote of the United Nations Security Council called upon North Korea to abide by these. North Korea is a signatory but not in compliance with the Biological Weapons Convention. North Korea is not one of the 190-some countries that are members of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and North Korea is not a member of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, nor is the United States, as that was not ratified here as well. We are pressing North Korea certainly for the elimination of nuclear, chemical, and biological, consistent with the longstanding wishes of the United Nations Security Council, and so that's very important. The mechanism for doing those, in my view, seems very usefully available in the Biological Weapons and the Chemical Weapons Convention, particularly. In the case of nuclear weapons, we're going to be pursuing a much larger vision than simply the comprehensive test ban, but it's not in conflict, certainly, with the objectives, but our diplomacy is about much, much more than the absence of nuclear testing. In the case of Chemical Weapons Convention, as the questioner points out, there is an organization called the OPCW, which is the implementing body for the Chemical Weapons Convention based in The Hague, and they could be a very important partner in working through and resolving the issues of chemical weapons in North Korea, and it's an idea that we should consider. On Biological Weapons Convention, the point was also made that there isn't a similar implementing agency associated with the Biological Weapons Convention. So it's going to be a little bit more complicated in that case to ensure that North Korea is in full compliance with the BWC. That's our goal. in both cases, in both the cases of chemical weapons and biological weapons, but we may need to develop some other mechanisms in order to arrive at the necessary assurances in the case of the Biological Weapons Convention. We've got a lot of work to do. Not all these issues are yet on the table with us. As I said to Helene earlier, we have raised all of them with North Korea, but the modalities and methodologies through which we're going to be able to achieve our aims, we're still working through. And of course, ultimately, we need the agreement of the North Koreans to do that if we're going to be successful.
We have 2 more minutes left. Last questions, please. Well, I'm going to take it then. What are they like to negotiate with?
They being the North Koreans. All of us who work on this issue are acutely aware of the magnitude of what we're undertaking, and we don't undertake it lightly. It is hugely reassuring to have the full support of the President and the Secretary of State for diplomacy. The entire administration is engaged on this issue, and as we go into the room with the North Koreans, it gives us a lot of confidence in speaking with them as to what is America's objective in this negotiation. I have to assume that in the room, the person sitting across the table from me has the same mandate and has the same sense of mission from their government. It can be challenging, for sure. In a system like that, you don't have a robust internal debate. You don't have thoughtful commentary from think tanks. You don't have critical or thoughtful reporting from media. You don't even have the makings of what we would have inside the U.S. government of an interagency process that constantly is dealing with the tension of keeping alignment on policies as complicated as this one. It's a very different system. It's driven by the top down, and that's why I'm such an enthusiastic supporter of the way the President has approached this. We have tried for 25 years to percolate positions up from the working level to the leadership level with no success. President Trump, in engaging Chairman Kim, has engaged the real decision maker in the North Korean system and the one who can truly create the space for my counterparts sitting across the table from me to be flexible, to be agile, to be creative, to find solutions to these issues. There's a lot of stress on the people on the other side of the table. You can feel that palpably when you talk with them. And these issues are difficult, as they should be, because these are very important issues for both countries. And as I said before, we're swimming against the tide of 70 years of history. But, there's a lot of things that come into play. Personal relationships, building of trust, the ability to communicate. It's going to take us a while to get there. But I am confident we can. The North Koreans, like the President, have made the decision to engage in this diplomatically. I have to operate under the assumption that those people are the right people, that they are capable, which I think they are, and that they have the trust and direction of their leadership in these negotiations. So, it's complicated with North Korea. That's a huge understatement. It's not like negotiating like I did in the private sector, and the consequences for failure for both sides are enormous as well, and so that weighs on it. But we've had a very successful set of engagements. We've been in discussions. We haven't produced an agreement. We didn't produce a joint statement out of the summit. There's not yet a point where we've closed the gaps necessary, but the discussions have been constructive. We've been engaged. This is what diplomacy is. This is what the President has committed and recommitted to coming out of the Hanoi summit. So they're people. That's what they are. And we just have to find a way to get to the right answer that represents the national security interests of our country, and they have the same mandate for their government.
Thank you so much, Steve. We're apparently going to be beaten if we don't stop right at noon, so we're stopping. At the end, I will read this. At the end of your session, please state the following. Please join us for lunch across the atrium in the ballroom. Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you, Helene.